Hi everyone, welcome back to Historically Speaking. It's been a while, but I'm back to do a new series of interviews that I'm super excited to do. Again, Historically Speaking is an online YouTube history channel focused on the history of various institutions and professionals, how history intersects with education, art, and culture in the world around us. I'm Karen Yang, your host. Today we have Kim Sajet, the director of the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. She is the first woman to serve in this role, which is super cool. And before her current appointment, she had a lot of experience with multiple historical societies, such as the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. She was also the director of corporate relations at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And she's had a lot of really great experience with just talking about art history, art, portraiture. She also runs the Portrait podcast, which is a podcast from the National Portrait Gallery. I highly recommend you take a listen. I listened yesterday. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And the museum has really just explored a lot of identity as a social construct and has just been really awesome in terms of looking at different parts of people's identity and using different medias to explore that as well. I'm so excited for Sajet to be here with us today. Is there anything else you'd like to add around your bio or around the museum's mission or anything else like that?
No, thanks, Kat. It's so great to be on the YouTube channel with you. That's kind of super exciting. Just to say that I'm so glad you listened to the Portraits podcast. I like to say that it's where art and history, biography and identity collide. And that's a little bit, I think, what you try to do too, but certainly what the Portrait Gallery is trying to do is sort of complicate history and investigate identity and nationhood through people.
100%. So actually, before we dive into the questions, I actually recently just finished up my school year with AP Art History, and I think this coursework has really been my first introduction to art and how it interferes, I guess, or influences our culture. And throughout, art history, the curriculum is really centered around the people of different cultures. And I was super interested in the portraiture. One of the first ones that really stick out to me is actually Rembrandt, and that's definitely a portrait that I really keep in mind very often when I'm studying or looking at art.
Well, as a Dutch girl by way of Australia, but I'm actually a Dutch national, Rembrandt van Rijn is natuurlijk, or I'm starting to speak Dutch now, but Rembrandt, of course, is a sort of a key person that I also am very influenced by and admire a huge amount from history. Yeah,
for sure. He's just I just love he dabbles in a little of cross etching, and he also dabbles in painting, and it's so amazing for sure. Without further ado, we're just gonna dive right in. I guess my first question would just be about the National Portrait Gallery as a whole. So could you walk me through the history of the National Portrait Gallery, I guess, or how it's gotten to be the way it is today?
Yeah, I mean, it was really based on this idea of elevating the important men, and that's how it started, of culture, going all the way back to the first portrait gallery. Well, actually, if you go really back, it goes back to sort of the princes and the principesses of Europe, right? Where you actually are doing the portraits of the kings and the queens and the royalty and nobility. And their portraits are getting installed in palaces. We know at a certain point under Napoleon, the Louvre actually becomes open, and it was a palace. It becomes a museum for the enlightenment of the general public. And there's this notion that somehow by looking at a portrait of somebody certainly who's rich and wealthy and powerful, it would elevate and inspire the general populace to sort of either admire them, maybe follow them, be dutiful to them, but also sort of think about how they would like to support them and be part of their lives, as good subjects would be. As over time, of course, then around the 1800s, the National Portrait Gallery in London is the first sort of established portrait gallery coming out of this this notion that if we put all the portraits of important people, and we can go
Mm-hmm.
into that question about who was designated as important,
Mm-hmm.
and open the doors as a museum, that everyone would somehow become more inspired. And
Mm-hmm.
the inference was that you become better citizens of Great Britain, and certainly
Mm-hmm.
better sort of subjects to the kings and
Mm-hmm.
queens of the country. But
Mm-hmm.
if you then transport that to the United States, where, of
Mm-hmm.
course, we fought Great Britain precisely to get away from royalty and beat
Mm-hmm.
the sort of George III, and set up our own democracy and republic,
Mm-hmm.
it takes quite a bit longer. In fact, it's not until
Mm-hmm.
1962 under President Kennedy, and then,
Mm-hmm.
of course, he's killed, and the museum opens in 1968 out under Johnson,
Mm-hmm.
that we open the Portrait Gallery of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And that has a very different feel. The
For
feeling, the
sure.
intention was by Congress, it was the people. Back then they would say the men and women, but now we talk about the individuals who
Mm-hmm.
have made an important national contribution to US history and culture.
Mm-hmm. 100%. I actually find that really fascinating that like very early on, like this portraiture was like this political kind of backing or had this like political background. I think when you were talking about that, Napoleon and all of his great like portraits just kind of really came to mind. And I think like everyone knows how he like sticks his hand in his like shirt or something like that, and all of his like great portraiture. And I think that that's really interesting to see that essentially like a great portion of this artwork was also kind of like propaganda in a way, and like being very explicit in its messaging. So I think that's like super cool to see how that has like ebbed and flowed through.
Yeah, and I mean that carried all the way to America as well too. But it wasn't actually propaganda in a way; it was
Mm-hmm.
absolutely propaganda. I always like to think of a sort of paraphrasing a quote by Pablo Picasso that says, "All art is a lie that illustrates the truth." I have
Mm-hmm.
a version of that also says that never trust a portrait, because everybody has a vested interest in a portrait, and it's sort of like a four-legged stool. On one leg you have the sitter, who, particularly as they become more and more famous, have a very vested interest. So you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
Napoleon. Napoleon wanted to be seated on horses, crossing the Swiss Alps, or as you say, the uniform was important. He was
Mm-hmm.
a kind of short and like dumpy kind of guy, but he wanted to look very big and
Mm-hmm.
regal, and not even more to the point, he wanted to be looking royal-like, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The second sort of leg of the stool is the artist, who would like to
Mm-hmm.
stay close to their own artistic practice and have their own vested interest. If
Mm-hmm.
someone doesn't like their portrait, they're not going to get any more work in the
Mm-hmm.
future, right?
Mm-hmm.
The third leg of the stool is often the patron, who's paying for it. And we
Mm-hmm.
know that is really important now in the conversations of monuments, for example, and we're
Mm-hmm.
discovering more and more about it. Had very little to do about the Confederacy or even the Civil War, but some of these monuments are created in the 1950s and 60s by
Mm-hmm.
a certain group of people who want to perpetuate a certain sort of myth about American history. And then
100%.
the fourth stool, the fourth leg of the stool is us, the
Mm-hmm.
viewer, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
when everyone else has died, the artist, the patron, and the sitter, we're still there. And each subsequent generation, I think, makes a portrait, even if it was made over 250 years ago, as
Mm-hmm.
contemporary for the moment as when you're looking at it or you're experiencing it.
Mm-hmm. 100%. I think like yeah, it's like always again in art history, AP art history, we always look at like the form, the function, the content, and the context. And like these four things interact with one another, just how like the viewers interact with the artist and what the artist wants to put out. And I think like especially I really love the point that you said about like the contemporariness of the piece, regardless of when it's being created. Because I think like portraiture, when you look at it, you see like a person, you see honestly you see what they want to see, but you also see like the context of where they were and who they became and all of the great things that make up what this person is all about, and you can kind of relate it to yourself and how you're feeling in that moment, I guess.
Yes and no, though, right? Be deeply suspicious, because, we
Mm-hmm.
like to think that manipulating images is a modern phenomena thanks to
Mm-hmm.
digital technology. and even with photography. But we know for a fact that artists, going all the way back, tried to trick the viewer. We even have the Greek myths, right, of the artist who tried to suggest that by painting some grapes that a bird would come down and eat the grapes because they were so realistic. We also have artists who would paint dead people into pictures, or we have photographers pre-digital who would erase people out of pictures. So, you really need to go in with a critical eye and don't trust everything that you look at. Even more so today, right? We're very, we really try to talk about what I like to talk about visual literacy. I think that people more and more have to really question what they're looking at and the motives behind them, and really ask themselves, is this really true? Because, artists and, of course, as you said, whoever's, behind the impetus of putting something else, the patron, the publisher, whatever, will have a vested interest on how things want to be interpreted and how people want to be interpreted.
No, 100%. I think art as a whole involves like the viewer, and honestly places like not necessarily a burden but more like a responsibility on the viewer to understand, number one, what they're looking at, and kind of, again, the context of what they're looking at. And I think that, as you said, it's always up to the viewer in a way to determine that, and determine like, hey, where are they glorifying something and where are they kind of telling the truth in a way. So I definitely agree. And I think that a lot of people my age and a lot of people who are like stepping into the art history world are also kind of developing the skill as we go, because it's definitely not something that necessarily comes really naturally. And I think that, like, especially with a lot of social media we have now, it's kind of easy to just slide into the mindset of like, hey, that looks really nice, or hey, this must be the reality of what everyone is feeling, even if that's not necessarily true for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always think about biologically, we're wired to think ahead, about the future. So, but it's a learnt skill. And one of the most valuable skills is to train yourself to look back in the past, historically, and ask yourself, how did we get here in the first place? Like, what were the decisions made? Why is it that certain communities live in certain neighborhoods? Why is it that, certain, portraits are in town squares and others aren't? Why have museums got certain histories represented and others aren't? And all of that comes from looking critically backwards. But if you can actually do that, I think it really helps you think about your present and where you want to go in the future, right? You don't take things sort of as a given. You become deeply suspicious. And I like suspicious people. I think that we need people who are really, thinking about and questioning about, what is it I'm being asked to believe? And then, do I really believe it? So if we go to portraiture, we talked about sort of the elitist portraiture for the royalty and sort of the nobility of Europe. But when it imports itself to America, where we got rid of all of those princes and kings, portraiture still then favoured those who could vote. And they, back in the time, were white men who owned land. So if you we have a couple of stressors, if you like, or real challenges in the portrait gallery. Firstly, portraiture was only made of a very select group of people. And so less than 25% of the sitters in the collection, of around 23,000 portraits representing 18,000 people, are of women. Because a portrait of a woman wasn't made unless they were married to a famous man, they were about to be married to a famous man, maybe the daughter of a famous man, right? You were somebody's property in a way. And so that old adage, well-behaved women rarely make history, definitely applies to portraiture. It's only the badly behaved women get their portraits made, right? But then when you go down to people once enslaved or immigrants or different religions, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, people with disabilities, again, these are not the people who are making it to be presidents and senators, and they're shut out of all sorts of leadership roles within the United States.
No, for sure.
And so I think that one of the things that I'm always really interested in is to unpack some of the origin stories of the United States. One of them has been this idea that, in fact, ability, if you like, if you work hard enough, you will be able to make it into whatever position you want. You can be president, you can be an astronaut, you can be a brain surgeon, right? But we know from the past that that is actually not true. And a whole lot of people, I mean, there was some version of the Asian Exclusion Act in place in 1965. So good luck, rising to the top and all sorts of things. So it's really difficult for a museum that is collecting the people who've made an impact on US history and culture when a whole ton of those people never got the opportunities to actually, no matter how skillful they were, how knowledgeable they were, how, suitable they were for jobs and positions, there was just never any way that they were going to get into some of the places in our hierarchy, social hierarchy. So that poses a real question for us, which is, how do we talk about e pluribus unum, right, that motto on the Great Seal of the United States, out of many one, when a whole lot of the many never got to, rise up to their highest ideals, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because oftentimes I think portraiture is a huge reflection of again, who has the money to be able to commission these things, or who has that status, or who is not frowned upon essentially, or excluded upon. And I think that's a really good point, that honestly, a lot of the art that we do study in school is very Eurocentric, or it's very focused on just certain very well-known artists of that time. But if we really think about it, there's so much history, and there's so many people within that context, or within that timeline, that we will never really get to acknowledge. Or if we don't necessarily think hard enough, or think critically enough, or remember, it's really just easy to forget that really, really important presence, and just kind of move on beyond that, which is definitely not what we should be doing, for sure. Yeah,
I mean, this question of meritocracy is deeply problematic, right? Because so many doors were shut to so many people. But then the big question for us now is, well, what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to sort of go forward as we become more inclusive? Because we know that the more people with the more skill sets and the more different but divergent viewpoints just makes us stronger, right? Makes us more innovative, makes us more creative. And 100%. So it's in our best interest to actually really broaden opportunities for people, as a nation.
Yeah, 100%. To just kind of wrap up our conversation, I guess, what would you say would be your favorite portrait? I know that's a huge and hard question, seeing with your position and seeing all the great portraits that the National Portrait Gallery has to offer, but do any or a few really stand out to you, I guess?
It really changes depending on what I'm thinking about at the time. I often like portraits for what they don't say, for the bits that are missing. So one of the ones that I talk about a lot is one by Schussel, and it's called Men of Progress. And it's kind of there's 19 white guys who are inventors, and in the background is the patron saint of US invention, Ben Franklin, and they're, Thomas Morse is right in the middle with his little machine for the Morse code. And it's kind of the Silicon Valley of today. But what's interesting to me is, what it's not representing. There are no women, there are no people of color. And even more, when you dig down into it, you realize that those 19 guys never got in a room together. It's completely fiction. At one point, they actually leave somebody out of the picture, John Erickson, who famously made a submersible military boat to help win the Civil War for the Union side. And they were all like, well, we better stick John in the background because that would be terrible to leave him out. So what I like about it, again, is this questioning and sort of all right, if this is what it's actually made in the 1860s, around the time of the war, and it looked
Mm-hmm.
like everybody's in harmony, and this is a country of innovation and ingenuity and
Mm-hmm.
technology. But the truth of the matter is, they're in the middle of a war. A whole lot of people are missing, and things are pretty fragile. And so it again
Mm-hmm.
shows you how art, and certainly portraiture, can be used to advance a political agenda, an agenda
Mm-hmm.
for a certain group of people, in this case, white, technology,
Driven
inventors.
guy.
Yeah. So again, be deeply suspicious, but when you
Mm-hmm.
start peeling back the layers, it can be super interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think yesterday I was like looking at the podcast and I think there was like an episode or something that referenced this image actually, and I searched it up and I looked at it just really briefly, like looked it over. I was like, I thought it was actually something that was like being made before the Civil War essentially. And I was like, oh wow, like I think like just as you said, it's really interesting to see what people choose to represent and what people hold back and what people substitute. And like I think like another portrait that I can really think of is like John Trumbull's like all of the
Yep.
signing of the Declaration of
Yep.
Independence. And I think there's like so many misconceptions of like when he painted that, which day it's representing. And it just kind of goes to show that art is really what we want, what the artist wants us to see. And if we don't choose to see something in a certain way, that we may lose that message or overlook something for sure.
Mm-hmm. And an extension of that is, it's about the art that gets painted or created for a certain purpose, by a certain, group of people, but then
Mm-hmm.
also the museums that we choose to create and what we
Mm-hmm.
choose to fill those museums and
Mm-hmm.
libraries and
Mm-hmm.
textbooks with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Smithsonian is about the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And so the
Mm-hmm.
question is, what is that knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
And, I like to think that knowledge is better than ignorance, but it's also
Mm-hmm.
about the type of knowledge that you
Mm-hmm.
are actually pursuing, and
Mm-hmm.
being super critical of,
Mm-hmm.
of that, because it only helps everyone else, right? Being very
100%.
inquiry, right?
Hmm. Yeah, just like pursuing new questions and new ideas for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, I think I'm gonna wrap up this conversation. It's been so great just talking about portraiture, and I feel like I could go on forever, to be honest. Um, do you have anything else you'd like to add or anything else you'd like me to like promote or anything else like that?
No,
No,
but thank you for inviting me. It's been
of
a
course.
pleasure.
No, it's been so great. To all my viewers out there, I'll see you guys all next time. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, just see everyone next time.